So I'd like to present our next speaker, Nickolas Boylan, who's coming to us all the way from University of California, Davis. And he's going to be speaking to us about why truth matters.
Thank you. I did couch after I submitted and had the paper accepted to at least one reason, because I think that will make criticism less severe. Yeah, I'm very excited to be speaking at a conference with such expensive video equipment, and I hope you like what I have to say. So I'm starting off with a Richard Rorty quote, which suggests, I think, as it is meant to, that this is more on the pragmatism than the philosophy of science side of the conjunction. But I have been recently hoping that I can branch out from this kind of discussion of truth to a more philosophy of science related discussion of truth. So I'm excited to hear if people have anything to say about that. So where this paper begins is with kind of the older 20th century view that was somewhat common among pragmatists and somewhat common in discussion of truth, that it's a mistake in general to distinguish between truth and justification. And this is a view that strikes people as very odd. I'm using Rorty's defense of this view as like my example of it, and I take out of that quote on the first slide this principle. He takes it that a big thing that it means to be a pragmatist for him is that your view should be defensible by appeal to practice, by appeal to what people are actually doing. And because of this, he thinks there's a big problem with distinguishing sharply between truth and justification. And the problem is just that if I ever ask you what I am meant to be doing after you tell me that the goal of doing inquiry is to discover the truth, you'll only ever tell me things about justifying my beliefs, because there doesn't seem to be anything you could do to get at the truth other than to continuously justify your beliefs. This is another way to put a similar point, that there's no way to get outside of all of your beliefs and figure out which ones are true and then start piecing the whole thing together from there. You always have to be doing justification. And because of this, Rorty argues that we should not distinguish between truth and justification, that from the perspective of practice, all there is justification. And so because of that, according to what I call his pragmatist principle, we can just do away with the talk of truth in itself. Specifically, in one of his papers, he targets Crispin Wright's view that you can distinguish truth and justification normatively. Rorty gives this analogy against distinguishing them. He imagines an archer in ancient Greece who is really would say that they are primarily concerned with making Artemis happy. But being the god of archery, the only way to make Artemis happy is to hit targets accurately when you're at archery competitions. And he points out that if you, even if they take it that what they're really guided by is making Artemis happy, if the only way they ever try to do that is by hitting targets at archery competitions, I don't need to appeal to Artemis at all to explain what they're doing and what it means to be successful. All I need to appeal to is what makes you better at hitting archery targets. And so as a result, he thinks that the situation with truth and justification is similar. He rejects the idea that Wright brings up, that you can distinguish them by what we're really guided by or what we take ourselves to be guided by, because he thinks it's clear in this archery example that we should only appeal to hitting the target. And the same ought to apply to truth. I initially like to present this as if his view is a little bit less nuanced than I think it actually is. He is clear that there just are differences between taking truth as the goal of inquiry and justification as the goal of inquiry. his point is more that there aren't any good functional reasons to take truth as the goal of inquiry. He thinks, for example, he uses the phrase metaphysically active inquirers, and he says they take truth to be their goal, and I think it's a very bad idea. I think it leads them down useless roads that don't get us anywhere. I like the way that Price puts the point, which is that it's one thing to establish that we do employ a realist notion, and an entirely different thing to establish that we ought to imply a realist notion. This is how I take the framing of the question. I think this is the sort of important framing of the question as being about what we ought to be doing, not just establishing whether or not we in fact take our goal to be pleasing Artemis or hitting the target, but asking the question, what should we take our goal to be doing? What difference does it make to take one as our goal rather than the other? And so that brings me to Price's view in Truth as Convenient Friction, primarily is where I'm taking this, where somewhat similarly to Wright, Price thinks that we can distinguish truth and justification along normative lines, and that they operate as different norms of assertion. So he presents 3 norms of assertion that each lend some character to dialogue that involves assertion. Sincerity, I won't talk about but very much, but it seems somewhat uncontroversial. And justification is another norm that obviously Rorty also agrees is important in communities. But Price thinks, I've just realized I don't know how they all ended up as 1. I trust you can all count that high and it won't make a big difference. But truth is the 3rd norm, not the 1st, the 3rd time over. There are a few different ways to present it. This is my preferred way to present it. You could also present it possibly more simply as if you're going to assert that P ought to be true. But I like this presentation of the norm because I think it makes clear what we're taking it that people in the community have to be doing in order for this norm to be present. And so, according to this formulation, for the 3rd norm to be present in a community, for truth to be distinct from justification, is for it to be the case that if somebody asserts P and I am prepared to assert not P, it should draw my disapproval. I should think that they are mistaken in their assertion of P. And I should think this automatically just on the basis of my being prepared to assert not P and their having just asserted P. So Price argues for this view by going and imagining a community that sort of did what Rorty asks us to do, that did away with this distinction and acted as if there were only the first 2 norms. You had to be sincere and you have to justify your assertions, but there is no kind of automatic disapproval when one person asserts P and I'm prepared to assert not P. This kind of community he calls a Moan community, and they make merely opinionated assertions. They don't take one person having asserted P and another having asserted not P to inherently draw any kind of disapproval. This is easy to see because all the time we have to acknowledge that I'm justified in asserting one thing and others are justified in asserting the opposite. Say, I believe that I just left my keys in the kitchen and nobody's touched them, but my partner knows that they moved my keys out of the kitchen. We might both be justified in asserting different locations for my keys, and we haven't violated either of the first 2 norms. We're both sincere and we're both justified, but I assert P and they assert not P. And so in such a community that sort of in some way did as Rorty would want us to do, there would be no automatic inherent normative character to disagreement because all the time we would have both lived up to every norm of the community and yet we would still be asserting incompatible things. Price's view is then that why this is important is what the third norm adds is this kind of pressure and encouragement to engage in reasoned debate with one another. I mean, the use of the word friction is very deliberate, like it makes our beliefs kind of grind against one another instead of just sliding past one another as if we hadn't really even said anything to each other. And he thinks that because this norm encourages reasoned debate, so long as there's a useful function to reasoned debate, then communities which have this norm will tend to prosper compared to those which don't. And thus, he holds that there is a good function-based reason to think truth and justification are distinct, because communities with the norm of truth will prosper compared to communities without the norm. So my kind of continuation of this is very heavily based in what Price has already said here. I don't go on to alter any of the three norms. I really like the formulation of all of them. And I think that at some level I basically agree with the reason that the norm is important. But I do think that there's some problem, at least, in the idea of grounding this argument for the importance of truth in an appeal to communities prospering relative to one another. I mean, one kind of simple reason that I think this might be problematic is that I've started off with kind of a narrow topic in philosophy, like, is there a norm of truth that differentiates it from norms of justification? And the idea that, like, to really get down to whether that's true or not, I'm going to have to go all the way back to one of the originating questions of philosophy and give you some account of what it would mean for two communities to prosper relative to one another and, like, what prosperity is. I just think that there are ways to get at why this is important where I can totally sidestep huge questions that puzzled everybody since the ancient Greeks. And so that's a lot of my goal, is to give kind of a different route of saying why I think this normative difference is really important and plays a really important functional role. And so my strategy is to just assume that the norm of justification is indispensable and does play an important role in human communities. My justification for this assumption is that I've never read anybody who thought we should do away with that one. If somebody does want to argue that, I leave it open to them, but the state of things right now is that, to my knowledge, people have just never even attempted to argue that we ought to do away with that one. And so I assume that that is an important and indispensable norm. And specifically, I assume it's important because it leads to less unjustified assertions being made in the community. I think it's technically possible that a norm like that would be important, but for some totally distinct reason. This happens sometimes with norms of other kinds, that they're important, but not for the reason you might initially think when you look at the norm. So I am assuming that justification is important specifically because it leads to less unjustified assertions being deemed acceptable in the community. And so I'm going to argue that we should make a distinction between what I call passive norms and activator norms. And then I will argue that justification considered on its own falls into what I call a passive norm, and that truth is capable of relative to justification, serving as an activator norm. And then I will argue not just that it could be the activator norm for justification, but that it is the reasonable choice for activator norm, and it is the particular norm that we ought to endorse for activating justification. So yeah, I have an example here that it was always political. Of course, It got so much more political, even by implication, after I wrote this paper, and so it will probably be changed. I would ask nobody to read politics into this example. So to get at, oh, the spacing is wrong. Okay, this is a horrible PowerPoint, but that aside. To get at this difference between passive norms and their activator norms, you might consider a community that tried to govern the crossing of its borders with only the following norm and no others. In order to acceptably cross a national border, one must have a valid passport with them. So I think that if we understand what it means for border crossing to be governed by only this norm, we should think that this norm alone does nothing at all to the community. Because say I am in the situation of somebody who wants to cross the border but does not have my passport, there's simply no reason for me to not cross the border. It doesn't tell me that anybody is allowed to check. It doesn't tell me that there's any reason for me to prove to anyone that I have a passport. It just kind of asserts that I ought to. And so I think that a community governed only by this norm would look essentially identically when we looked at practices of people to a community governed by no norms whatsoever regarding illegal border crossing. I think that this is sharply in contrast to a community governed by this norm and some norm like what I've called checkpoint, which says that not only do you need a passport with you, but you need to go through specific locations and show somebody that you have your passport with you. Once we have this, the first norm is in some sense activated. It doesn't replace the first norm because, of course, if I only had checkpoint, you could still cross the border without a passport. It doesn't say you need a passport inherently, but it activates the first norm. It makes it such that the presence of the first norm actually matters to the community. And so this is how I've described passive norms as norms which have little or no impact on their community because they call for the evaluation of actions which relevant community members are usually not in the proper epistemic position to evaluate. And what an activator norm does for me is allow for the effective operation of passive norms by bridging that epistemic gap and making it such that relevant agents are in a position to actually enforce norms that we think are present in the community. So why do I think justification is a passive norm? Well, the reason is that when you read it, it asks me, somebody hearing an assertion, to assess the acceptability of the assertion according to whether or not the person making it has adequate reason. So it asks me to evaluate their assertion in terms of their other beliefs. But of course, people's other beliefs are not usually present with their assertion of some matter of fact, and I don't have a good way of just inherently knowing about their other beliefs. And so it means that if you assert P and all we are governed by is the norm of justification, and I don't know you yet, I don't know anything about your other beliefs, say, I just never have any reason to object to your assertion of P. I just will think, okay, I mean, maybe they have adequate reason to believe P, but since I don't have access to that, I don't have a reliable way to get at whether or not you have actually violated that norm. And so if justification is important because it leads to unjustified assertions being deemed acceptable less of the time, then there's just going to be a problem in communities that are governed only by justification, which is that there's no reason for me to ever actually have justifications for my assertion. I can just assert whatever I want because other people don't have access inherently to my own beliefs. And then the way that I think truth could serve as an activator norm for justification is based on the, like, one primary difference between the norms of truth and justification, which is that while justification asks me to deem unacceptable assertions that are not adequately justified by the other person's other beliefs, truth asks me to evaluate my own beliefs and then deem acceptable or unacceptable other people's assertions according to whether they agree with my beliefs or not. And my beliefs, in sharp contrast to other people's beliefs, are the type of thing that I have pretty good access to. I know whether I'm prepared to assert P. Well, sometimes I'm not sure about things. If you ask me too complicated of a question, I might just not know. But most of the time, I know whether I'm prepared to assert P, and I know when you've asserted something I'm prepared to assert the negation of. And so there's no epistemic gap there. I know when I should disapprove of your assertion, when I should think you're mistaken, and when I should approve of your assertion. And going back to what Price says about pressuring reasoned debate, I think that this is exactly how truth is able to activate justification, because the particular character of my disapproval of your assertion leads me to essentially demand that you justify your assertion to me. And once that's done, now I have your assertion and your justification for your assertion, and now I can assess whether, even if we disagree, you've also violated the norm of justification, whether you also don't have any justification for what you've asserted to me. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So I don't think this is quite enough. I think I also need to show that, did it again, that this is the right norm. And so I think we can consider two other possible norms. First, mandatory justification. You could have a community where you always justify your assertions. This is a disaster. The justification of most assertions is going to be another assertion. And we don't have infinite conversational time. And so we just can't have mandatory justification. We'll never finish talking about anything. So I say that this norm is not efficient. Or we could attempt to solve that problem by doing something like adding initial justification. You have to justify your main assertion or your first assertion. This norm has the problem that it's not reasonable. Say I tell you that my keys are in the kitchen, and you ask why I believe that, and I tell you that it's because I was just in there. But secretly, my reason for believing I was just in there was that God spoke to me that I was just in there, despite my not remembering having been in there. That seems like the type of belief that we might want to demand justification for, but it just flies totally by because it's not the initial one. So I call this one not reasonable. It's just not asking for the right justifications. What I think we need is a norm that asks for justification less than all the time, and specifically in particularly important situations. And so I think truth does both of these. I think that it's efficient because when I'm prepared to assert P, I don't need to elicit your justification for P. I can instead examine my own justification to see whether I think P is justified. And so I can get around demanding justification when I don't need to, and we get out of the infinite chain of justifications. And I think it's reasonable because MacArthur calls this the norm of consistency and argues that, in fact, truth is just a communalized version of this on Price's account. And so if I'm abiding by the norm of consistency, just that if I judge P, I shouldn't also judge not P, then whenever you assert that P and I am prepared to assert that not P, I have good reason for thinking that I'm not going to have justifications for asserting not P, because if I had them, I shouldn't be prepared to assert P in the first place. So I have a little bit more on a possible response from Rorty, but I think for time, I'll leave the rest for Q&A.
Thank you, that was very nice. Your comment at the beginning about how it's nice to be at a conference with good video equipment made me think of the time, almost exactly 25 years ago, when I first gave a talk on this stuff. We didn't have good video equipment, but we did have Rorty. I was the more fortunate. Just a couple of comments. I mean, I like the general framework and the distinction between active and passive norms. I don't know if you know, but I can't remember what Rorty said 25 years ago, but and a couple of times after that, I think in versions of the paper as it developed, and he sent me some comments in email, and they were eventually put together with some replies by me, and were published in my Dave MacArthur's volume around 2010. And one of the things he says there is that he thinks my example of the moans, that they're merely opinionated assertions of the group who don't have the third norm, he thought that was entirely unrealistic for Davidsonian reasons. Now, I think that point might have connections with your project in two ways. One is it occurred to me recently, I was reading, very belatedly reading Bernard Williams' book, Truth and Truthfulness, thinking about what I was doing in the sort of framework of genealogy he develops. But one of the things he stresses, drawing on Edward Craig's work on the genealogy of knowledge, is that genealogies don't have to be realistic. They entirely, very unrealistic just so stories can be useful, in particular in exhibiting the function of whatever the genealogy of. And it seemed to me that that was might be a potential response to your worry about having to solve these ancient issues in philosophy before you get the story going. If you see the project in this just so story way, I don't think there's a need to do that. The other point was that picking up on Rorty's objection that the moans were unrealistic, he invoked Davidson at that point, saying that for Davidsonian reasons, any community that has a language has to have a kind of community-wide notion of objectivity, being right or wrong. And it seemed to me that that point played, right into my hands, because that notion is effectively the third norm. And so I thought that little twist via Davidson might be helpful to have on your radar too, in thinking about the distinction between active and passive norms.
Yeah, so I will say that the book I've brought to read on the plane is Davidson. I'm currently working my way through that. I guess just to respond to the first part, I don't take it that the problem is that you would need to solve these problems of prosperity to get it off the ground. It's more that, say you're talking to somebody who is just hardcore in favor of Rorty's view, I think that the problem is more like if they say, well, why should I think that communities will prosper with this and not prosper without it? I think then you're going to get into a whole sidetracked conversation. So I guess that I think is probably extremely difficult to resolve. And so I think the benefit is more that I think the challenge here is to say how you can even have a community that robustly has a norm like the one they say should be the only norm without adding this additional norm on top of that.
Yeah, I agree that's the more important.
Laura?
Thanks, that was great. Can I try an activator norm out on you? Maybe part of the question is this an activator norm? I'm going to call it reconciliation. If you believe P and I believe not P, we should figure out why we disagree. And will that get us as much community benefit as truth would?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I'm inclined to think actually weirdly based on some other Rorty, the more political side of Rorty, that one problem this will have is that sometimes we're talking about politics or we're talking about something where it's well and good to figure out why we disagree about P, but actually it's of great importance which of us wins about whether we should assert P or not P. And so I think in cases like that, it might be very different. But I do think that something like that, there's, even in this quote from Rorty, he kind of says like, well, why should we disapprove of each other? We're tolerant people. And so I think it is possible that something more like that governs especially philosophical communities a lot of the time, where I don't really lastingly disapprove of people. But I think that it's possible that that will work. I think the problem is that I suspect people are just constituted such that we do have this kind of more disapproval tinged thing. And I think that that's made less icky feeling maybe by remembering that the disapproval is specifically something like thinking they're mistaken. And all the time I get along with people who I think are horribly mistaken. Yeah.
Actually, we're just out of time, Bill. I'm sorry. Oh, and okay. I apologize. There were 2 other people in the queue ahead of you, but in the interest of time, I apologize to those 2. So we can have a coffee break. Maybe you can ask Nick the question again. So let's thank Nickolas.